Imagine, May 326 BC, northwestern India, the Hydaspes River in monsoon flood. Alexander III has never been stopped by a water crossing. He bridged the Hellespont, forced the Granicus under fire, threaded the Hindu Kush. The Hydaspes presents a different problem. King Porus of the Pauravas holds the eastern bank. Over 100 animals trained for battle stand at the waterline. Macedonian war horses will not approach war elephants. They are not trained to face them, and the scent of these massive animals alone is enough to disrupt their discipline. He cannot simply outrun this problem. He must outthink it. He arrived knowing what he would face. At Taxila, officers familiar with Porus's command style had briefed him in detail. Porus would anchor on the elephants. He would use the river as a barrier rather than seek open ground. Patience was his method. Alexander drew one conclusion: a direct assault would fail. The only viable option was to reach the eastern bank without a defended crossing. Doing that required conditioning Porus's army to stop trusting its own scouts. The elephants were not merely dangerous, they were structurally dangerous. Deployed at intervals across a line, each one created a zone Macedonian cavalry could not enter. The horses refused. A phalanx driven into that screen would be broken not by discipline but by mass. Porus had extended this logic to the bank itself. Elephants at the waterline meant any force emerging from the river would be disordered before it could form. The crossing was not the obstacle. What stood on the opposite bank was. For weeks he staged a deception at scale. Units marched the western bank in daylight, loudly, visibly, surveying crossings they would never use. After dark, cavalry units approached shouting, as though an assault was forming. Porus moved to meet it. Nothing happened. He repeated this every night, until the pattern established itself. Western bank activity meant nothing. Only when that lesson was absorbed could the real movement begin. The real crossing point lay 14 miles north. A forested headland split the current into two narrower channels. Over several nights, boat sections were moved there and hidden under vegetation. An officer named Attalus wore Alexander's armour and kept a visible schedule in the main camp. When a monsoon squall arrived, rain and thunder masking any sound, Alexander moved north with his strike force. The weeks of theatre ended. The operation began. The crossing force comprised roughly 6,000 foot soldiers and 5,000 riders, not the complete army. Craterus held the main camp with orders to cross only after Porus had fully committed north. Alexander forces the battle. Porus commits everything he has. Craterus crosses and closes from behind. The same encircling geometry that had ended Issus, executed here in monsoon flood, against an adversary who ballasted his flanks in living tons. The first crossing went wrong. The force grounded on a large island in midstream. A second fast channel lay ahead. Daylight was less than an hour away. The vessels were dragged across the island and relaunched. The second channel was crossed. But a scout on the eastern bank had observed them assembling. The tactical advantage the entire plan depended on was spent before the army had formed into line. Porus dispatched his son with 2,000 riders and 120 chariots. The objective? Catch the Macedonians still organising and hold them disorganised until the full Indian force could close. Tactically correct. The ground defeated it. Several days of rain had reduced the soil near the bank to mud. Chariot warfare requires speed across firm terrain. The wheels dug in almost at once. The charge stalled before it gathered speed. Horse archers raked the stalled vehicles. Cavalry moved up. The companions struck. Young Porus fell in the fighting. The force retreated. King Porus received word of his son's death while already advancing north. He brought everything he had. Over 200 war elephants, by Arrian's account, placed at regular intervals across his battlefront, a screen designed to prevent any formed advance from reaching his infantry. Cavalry on each wing. Infantry between the animals. Alexander had roughly 11,000 engaged. Craterus still held position across the water. The problem was the same one it had always been. The animals in the front line. The battle opened with misdirection. Horse archers pressed toward the Indian left. Porus transferred cavalry from his stronger wing to meet the threat. Conus had been held at the right wing for this moment. When the Indian right thinned, he swept around the outside of the formation and drove into Porus's right flank cavalry from behind. The Indian horsemen, caught from front and rear, retreated toward the elephant centre seeking cover. In retreating there, they brought disorder directly into the formation they had sought protection from. The elephants advanced. Metal-reinforced tusks, archers firing from platforms above, uncontrollable weight at full momentum. The front ranks of the phalanx absorbed the kind of casualties the campaign had not seen before. Alexander had positioned light infantry across the formation beforehand, each with one assignment: reach the men on top. The mahuts, the riders who directed each animal, were the only thing standing between a battle weapon and an unguided mass. The light infantry found them. As the mahuts dropped, the animals lost guidance. A war elephant in pain, without a rider, does not hold formation. It moves, away from the source of pain, through anything in that direction. The elephants turned into the Indian infantry behind them. Men who had positioned themselves behind the animal's screen for protection were now being killed by it. Craterus began crossing the river. Craterus struck the Indian formation from the south. The phalanx pushed from the north. The cavalry enclosed both flanks. No exit remained. Porus fought on his elephant until the battle had ended without him. Alexander sent a familiar face with an offer to talk. Porus came down. Alexander asked how he wanted to be handled. Porus gave a one-sentence answer: the way a king handles a king. Alexander restored his kingdom, then added to it: the losses at Hydaspes were the heaviest since Gaugamela. The elephant engagement had produced a kind of fighting for which the army had no previous model. In the weeks after, Bucephalus died. The animal that had carried Alexander since childhood, through every terrain the campaign had crossed, died of age and accumulated wounds in the Punjab. Alexander established a city nearby. He gave it Bucephalus's name. Intelligence from the east described the Nanda Empire. False estimates that made Porus's army look like a vanguard. More elephants, longer campaign. At the Hydaspes River, the army declined to continue. Not because of an obstacle, because the men who had marched from Macedon, 8 years out, their equipment worn to nothing, their dead from the Aegean to the subcontinent, had given everything they had. They sat in their tents. They did not move. Alexander addressed them for 3 days. He described the ocean to the east. He asked. The army did not respond. He ordered the army south. He never moved east again. The Hydaspes had been the last crossing into unmapped territory. Not because Porus could not be beaten, because the men who beat Porus had spent the last thing they had at getting there. He died in Babylon in 323 BC, 32 years old, 12 years of campaign without a military defeat. His generals asked who should take the empire. The phrase attributed to him, "Whoever proves strongest." Within a generation they had divided it. Within a century most of it was reshaped beyond recognition. His name was not